So I was reading an article before we get into it. I was reading an article. I was reading a couple different articles. I read a bunch to get ready for the show.
Yeah,
And
of course.
what do we want to talk about? What articles do we want to talk about? And it's driving me nuts. I saw the term "begs the question" misused like 100 times, and
I might misuse that.
you might misuse
Educate
it.
me. Let's see if
Okay.
I
All right.
know how to use it
That's
properly.
that's what we're going to do. We're actually diving into a very common phrase in the English language that's very often misused. So, and I think it's also misunderstood, and that is begs the question. The term actually pops up in conversation a lot. It pops up in debates and writing and all over the place. But its true meaning is frequently confused with a very different expression. So I wanted to clear things up. I wanted to go with a very straightforward explanation that also ties into the Second Amendment. The phrase begs the question actually originates from logic and philosophy, and specifically from argument and debate, from that whole field. It's got a very specific meaning. It refers to a logical fallacy where an argument assumes the truth of its conclusion without providing evidence. So what does that mean? Well, in other words, what it means is it's when someone makes a claim that sneakily assumes the very thing that they're trying to prove. It's kind of a circular argument. So what's an example? So an example is if someone says, "This book is the best because it's the greatest." That's a very elementary example, right? But if you say, well, this book's the best, and it's the best, well, it's because it's the greatest. It's one of the greatest novels ever written, and that's why it's the best. Well, you haven't actually proven anything, It doesn't actually, saying it's the best because it's the best isn't actually proving that it is in fact the best. And in that scenario, they are begging the question. So why? Well, like I said, it can't be the best because it's the best. Just because it's generally considered the best, and that's what makes it the best, isn't that why it's the best? Okay, so
Is it begging a specific question, or is it saying that by doing that circular reasoning thing, they have begged the question?
So the question in that scenario is, what book is the best?
Okay.
So if you say this book is the best because it's considered the best, you are now begging the question.
I see.
So, and that's where people get confused, and we'll get into that in just a minute.
Okay.
But I want the second.
I'll sit tight.
Yeah, sit tight. I know you're on the edge of the seat with this lecture on the English language. I promise it's Second Amendment related. So the Second Amendment example would be that the Second Amendment guarantees an individual right to own any type of firearm anywhere because the Second Amendment protects the right to keep and bear arms. Right? It's kind of a circular argument. The argument is begging the question. You're not making the case that, hey, the Second Amendment, is important because it helps us defend ourselves, and therefore the Second Amendment is one of the most important protections of our rights. You're just saying, well, we have the right to keep and bear arms because of the Second Amendment says we have the right to keep and bear arms. Right? You're begging the question there. Now, let me talk a little bit. Let me go a little bit further, because this is where it gets a little tricky. In everyday language, people often say begs the question when they're actually meaning to say it raises the question. This raises the question, whatever that question is. It isn't an example of begs the question, because that has a very specific definition. They're actually raising a question. So, for example, someone might say the Padres' loss begs the question, why didn't they practice more? In that case, they're using the phrase to suggest that the situation naturally leads to a follow-up question. They're not actually begging the question. They're raising the question, why didn't they practice more? And that's not right. So when you say something begs the question, you're not pointing out that a question arises. You're highlighting a flaw in their reasoning, where their conclusion is assumed from the very, very start. They're not actually proving what they're saying. They're just saying it's this way because I say it's this way, and that's why it's this way, and that's begging the question. So let's look at another example that I jotted down here. Saying that stealing is wrong. This is a little bit more of a sophisticated example, right? Saying that stealing is wrong because it's illegal begs the question. Stealing's not wrong because it's illegal. Stealing is wrong for a variety of moral reasons. There are a lot of reasons to say, hey, this is why stealing's wrong. It hurts people. It's against private property, whatever. There's a lot of different reasons to explain to somebody why stealing property is the wrong thing to do. And because it is wrong, we have made it illegal. Stealing isn't wrong because it's illegal. It is illegal because it's wrong. So to say that stealing's wrong because it's illegal, and that's why it's illegal because it's wrong, that's begging the question. You're just going in a circle. You're not actually making a point about morality or private property or stealing or anything. And I think why a lot of people get it wrong or misuse it is because begs sounds like you're asking or pleading for something, like a question, which of course makes sense. But because they've just decided that, hey, this phrase actually has a specific meaning, it's being misused. And it's an easy mistake to make in casual conversation. It's very, very, easy. But when you're in writing, especially when you're an author, and you're making the case, you should probably use it correctly. And this really isn't about me saying, hey, use the English language more correctly, What I'm saying is, and what my point is, that it's annoying, and I'm kind of a stickler for a couple. There's a couple things in the English language that I'm a big stickler for. I love Oxford commas, and when you misuse a cliche, I get all excited, and when people say begs the question when they mean raise the question, that's something that annoys me. But who cares what I think? Who cares what annoys me? That's, what's the point here? It's an important reminder, but it's not just a reminder to use the language correctly. But it's a reminder to explain your arguments more efficiently and more effectively. When you're talking about the Second Amendment, never use an argument or explanation that does not, in fact, beg the question. People naturally pick up on that. Even if they don't understand the term begs the question, even if they don't understand that that's what you're doing, if you well, hey, we have the Second Amendment, and that's why I can, have the right to keep and bear arms. I mean, it's just how it is. People naturally pick up on that, lack of logic or that fallacy or that circular argument. We naturally have the right to self-defense. Without the ability to actually defend ourselves, that right's completely and totally meaningless. The government standing in the way of us obtaining the most widely wanted and most effective self-defense tool ever, which is, of course, a gun, that's infringing on our self-defense. And that's an explanation for why the Second Amendment is important. That's why we have the right to keep and bear arms. Everyone's right to self-defense, it's crucial. It's natural. That natural right exists, and it's good for humanity. We've codified it in the most important government document that we have, the Constitution. And we did that by writing the Second Amendment. But with or without the Second Amendment, we have the right to self-defense. But without the Second Amendment, the government can and will block your ability to exercise that right. With the Second Amendment, the government will always be limited, and of course it's our responsibility to make sure it stays that way. But that's why it's important not just to not annoy me, but to use the term begs the question correctly, but then actually take the step further and not beg the question when it comes to the Second Amendment. So there, what do you think of that, Dakota?
I appreciated the language arts lesson. I think it's good to know. I definitely have been misusing that.
You're not alone.
Yeah, I didn't actually know it was a logical fallacy, which is interesting, and it makes sense the way you explained it. I think it's important for all of us to think about how are we making arguments. I see that particular Second Amendment one all the time. Second Amendment, protects our right to keep and bear arms because the Second Amendment says so. That's why it is so. I see that all the time. So it's a good reminder for everybody.
There you go. Yeah, I can carry a gun because of the Second Amendment.
Yeah.
Well, that begs the question. Quite literally begs the question.
Right.
That's exactly an example of begs the question.
Yeah.
So why is it important for you to to carry a gun? Well, self-defense and my natural right, et cetera, et cetera. So there you go. So use begs the question. Here's my homework for you. my call to action. Use the term begs the question correctly one time this week. And then
call someone out for having a bad logical argument.
Well, I was going to say the big advantage is once you've noticed how to, begs the question and you know how to use it, you're going to feel so much more superior when you see somebody misuse it, and you get to kind of passive aggressively correct them. So it's a huge advantage. So there you go. That's my begs the question rant. Hey, thanks for watching Gun Owners Radio. I hope you loved that clip. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and follow us on social media, and check out our website at gunownersradio.com.